from NHCSR here. I get a special request, which I was very happy to respond to. I'm sorry it took me so long. A small-scale market farmer in Tamworth, New Hampshire, had a very specific question. They said, I would love to see a talk about integrated pest management using grower degree days for food crops. I cannot seem to find a comprehensive list for the common bugs that give me the most problems. I think part of the reason there is not a comprehensive list for this kind of thing, it's twofold. Some of it is that the data just don't exist for the complex of pests that impact everybody, but there's a couple other reasons which I like to get into. Their list of 4 top priorities for their large-scale garden was flea beetles, Mexican bean beetle, squash bugs, and stink bugs. And this is a perfect list because it covers many of the plant families that we usually find in our gardens. I'm going to make some assumptions because I don't know exactly what their pest status is, the specifics of the damage. Once I make a few assumptions, that means that it might impact anybody who's listening. So please weigh in. Let me know what your pest problems are of interest and exactly what kind of problems they're causing. There are several factors that influence the severity of any one pest species in any one specific location. First of all, it comes down to presence. Have they found your garden? So especially in newly established gardens or even larger, long-standing gardens that happen to be geographically isolated, maybe they're in the woods, maybe they're not nearby other wild alternative hosts. Some of the most common pest species, we call them key pest species that you see in commercial fields. Sometimes they just don't show up in your garden. We're not really sure why. Maybe it's because they haven't found them. On the other hand, it's very hard to predict because at the same time, that geographic isolation might also make it very hard for those pest insects' natural enemies to find your garden as well. All right, the second factor, population. Once populations have established and built up in your neighborhood, it's not just your garden, it's your neighborhood, because these 4 pest species, they all overwinter as adults in the duff, the leaf debris in protected areas, probably outside of your farm or outside of your planting if you are doing traditional tillage methods. So once populations have established and built up in your neighborhood, you might see big surges at discrete times throughout the year. And that is really what the question gets to, is how to predict these surges based on growing degree days, because these insects, their growth rates depend on the temperatures at hand. So there's lots of behavioral things, there's lots of growth things that are influenced by the ambient temperatures around them. So you can look up information about all of these pests with general comments like you see them in May. But if that comment was written by somebody in Virginia or Maryland, that's not very much help to somebody in New Hampshire. So we can use degree days to track this development in your own backyard. That's what makes this question so great. So even better, we now have resources like NEWA. This is NEWA, the Northeast Weather something. This is a website hosted by Cornell Cooperative Extension, and it has all sorts of little tools, predictive models that uses some forecasting, some real-time temperature data being collected on farms. What makes this really special is that on-farm data, right? So many folks who have fancy-dancy weather stations have opted to be part of the NEWA network, and they send their data to this website. If you are lucky enough to live down the street from a farm who has opted to be part of this network, you have some really valid data from right down the street. You don't have to rely on temperature data that was recorded in the middle of an airport tarmac, which is what we used to have to do a long time ago. And it's a great resource. Please check it out and find out if you have a weather station down the street from you. Another factor that can throw some wrenches into these prediction models is insect behavior. So some insects will live and die in your crop. They'll complete a whole life cycle within that crop. Some insects will move in and out of your garden a little bit. And that has more to do with changes in crop physiology. So how good of a host is it at any different time of the year? We'll get to this later. Another big important factor when we talk about integrated pest management and thinking about thresholds, like how many bugs or how many beetles is a problem for you. We're talking about susceptibility of the crop. So there's plenty of folks who don't have issues with some of these key pests, and it might be simply luck of timing. Maybe they have gotten their plants in a little bit earlier. That plant grew up and was a big, robust plant that could handle more damage by the time that bug shows up. So you can see where, some years will be worse than others based on the lack of timing. Okay, so let's get into these 4 examples, which I think are excellent examples in this particular garden. So this question cited flea beetles as a key pest in their garden. I'm going to assume they're talking about the flea beetles that attack brassica crops. But every plant family has their own complex of flea beetles that cause that characteristic shot hole feeding damage that the adults will chew in the leaves. But I know that most people will see damage from flea beetles that eat brassicas. This is what I hear the most about. Every once in a while, we will hear problems with flea beetles that eat like tomatoes or eggplant, the solanaceous species. That is a completely different group of insects. So here in New England, 2 species of flea beetles that feed on brassica leaves as adults and on roots as larvae are striped flea beetle and crucifer flea beetle, Philotrata striolata and Philotrata cruciferi. So they are closely related. They are in the same genus, Philotrata, and they do both overwinter as adults, but they vary a little bit because striped flea beetle is active at cooler temperatures than crucifer flea beetle. So depending on what your species composition is in your garden, it could make some differences as to when you start seeing them in the spring. So I mentioned that these insects overwinter as adults, which means they spend the winter kind of passed out in leaf litter. So they find themselves underneath plant debris, kind of at that soil surface that is well protected. So it does get quite cold. It can get freezing, but it doesn't get much colder than freezing. So these insects have evolved to be able to tolerate that for a very, very long period of time. So if you're thinking about protected areas surrounding fields, hedgerows, wooded areas, fence lines, ditch banks, and then when it is warm enough for them to get active, that soil temperature gets above freezing. In the case of the striped flea beetle, they might start moving around once the temperatures get above freezing. It takes a little bit more heat for the crucifer flea beetle, but once you hit the 50s, like consistent 3 or 4 days above 50, they will start moving around. Once soil temperatures get up to 59, you might have a weather station that's recording soil temperatures, and once you start seeing air temperatures in the 60s, they can start flying. So temperatures cooler than that, they're walking. Once you get in this, like the mid 60s, high 60s, they can start flying. They can start readily moving into gardens that have their preferred hosts. So I know a lot of people will overwinter certain brassica crops. It makes them, they're very delicious. But taking a look at another tool I found online, this Farmer's Almanac suggested that something like broccoli can be transplanted outdoors in Tamworth, New Hampshire, starting May 9th to the 23rd. So we should be expecting these overwintered adults to be fully active and looking for their host plants during this period of time. Bad timing, I guess. Exclusion netting is often used to keep these beetles from finding young broccoli plants. So the recommendation for something like broccoli is that once those plants have established and they have at least 4 true leaves, they can really take a beating from flea beetle feeding injury, that adult flea beetle injury. Basically, the plant will compensate for even some of the heaviest feeding, up to 25% defoliation. For a flea beetle, 25% defoliation on a nice big plant, that's pretty heavy duty. I've never seen that before in real life. When they're smaller, that will have a bigger impact in the plant. So cotyledon stage in the first couple of true leaves. So exclusion netting to keep them off until then, and then you should be fine. But if you really want to know the details, we are in luck because there happens to be a weather station right in Tamworth, New Hampshire. So I used their weather data query tool to take a look at the data collected from January 1st until May of this year. I will also say that this particular site, it looked like a lot of the entries in the early season said estimated data. I think what happens is if there's an error, if that weather station fails to send data to the network, they estimate it based on neighboring weather stations. So if you have a lot of weather stations in your area, that should be fine. Looking at these data, I do see a warm spell that might have gotten some of these beetles going around March 10th, maybe not, and then again around April 10th. So if this garden is dominated by the striped flea beetle, the one that is a little bit more cold tolerant, you might see them moving in a little bit earlier by mid-April. If the dominant species is crucifer flea beetle, like those shiny black ones, maybe not until about now. It's mid-May right now. If there's brassicas in the garden, you might need to protect them if they're little. But you might be more interested in predicting fall populations of flea beetles, because this species kind of goes through a little bit of a quiescence. You stop seeing them after a period of time, and this is because the majority of the population is below ground. So the adults that move in, they lay eggs at the base of the plant, those eggs hatch, and the larvae burrow down. It would take a very, very big population of flea beetles to have any impact of the below ground feeding on above ground. So we don't really worry about that, and we don't see them. So it seems like they reappear magically later on in the summer, and that is because they are emerging again in the fall. So this summer population will emerge roughly 1,100 to 1,300 growing degree days in base 10 from that date that you first started seeing them in their garden. We'll say May 1st in this case. I looked at NUA's degree day calculator, you can find that, and I looked at the data collection in Tamworth last year from 2025 as an example, and it looks like Tamworth didn't hit 1,100 growing degree days until late September or early October. So I wonder if that sounds right. For those of you in the North Country, is that about when you start seeing that first full generation of flea beetles? Let me know. All right. Moving to another pest and another crop. Mexican bean beetles. This is a real curiosity to me because I don't see them very often, but sometimes they can be a real problem. They are super interesting because they are a coccinellid beetle. Their closest relative is the lady beetle. We often think about lady beetles as being the good guys. They are predators that provide ecosystem services for us in our gardens by eating pests. But many of these species, and there's many, many species of lady beetles, the native ones that live in our garden, some of them are more predatory, they're more meat eating, and many species are omnivores, that they'll eat other insects, but they'll also eat pollen, and sometimes they'll bite into a fruit when they're thirsty and desperate. And then there's this one species, Mexican bean beetle. They're kind of the black sheep of the family. I think it's the only pest species in the family. You can distinguish the adult by the straight line of dots across its back. You don't see that on lady beetles. Also, the larvae are incredibly distinctive. You really can't mistake this for anything else. They're so spiky. So the adults and larvae both feed on leaves of plants in the bean family exclusively. You won't see these on other plant families. And their feeding damage is pretty unique too. They cause something we call skeletonizing damage. So they won't eat the plant veins, they'll just eat that soft photosynthetically reactive tissue in between the plant veins. Again, if you have nice, healthy, vigorous growing plants, the plants will compensate for loss in leaf tissue. So I read that common beans can withstand something like 45 to 80% defoliation during the vegetative stage. The plants can be a little bit more sensitive to this during flowering and pod-filled stages. They can still lose up to 20% of their foliage and not have the yield impacted. So keep that in mind, knowing that they can handle a little bit of damage. They're more sensitive when the plants are flowering, so that might be when you target your attention to these plants. A lot of home gardeners can just hand pick these beetles off plants to avoid hitting that threshold. Knock them into a jug of soapy water or something like that, because they're all up on the plant. They're not in any other, part of the garden. Just like flea beetles, Mexican bean beetles will overwinter as adults in the duff, out in those protected areas, usually outside of cultivated fields. Adults will emerge around 250 to 300 growing degree days accumulated from January 1 using base 50. So when you go to NUA and use the degree day calculator, make sure to enter those details. Looking at last year from 2025, that was something like June 16th to June 20th in Tamworth. Let me know if that makes sense. Those adults will continue to feed on plants through the fall, but they'll also lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch into larvae that also cause feeding damage. The larvae peak somewhere between 700 to 900 growing degree days, and that was somewhere between July 30th and August 8th last year, 2025 in Tamworth. Those larvae will pupate right on the plant, which is kind of unique for most insect pests, and you should expect to see the second generation of adults somewhere between 1,300 to 1,500 growing degree days, which was not until November of last year. Let me know if that sounds right. So those adults will likely be seeking out their overwintering habitats by that point. So looking at the little tool for recommended planting dates for sowing, so direct seeding snap beans in Tamworth somewhere between May 30th to June 20th. So later planted beans might get hit a little bit harder. So, 45% injury is easier to accomplish with fewer leaves. So you might think about exclusion netting to keep those bean beetles off of your plants. All right, let's move on to another pest on the list, which is another crop family, that is squash bug attacking cucurbit plants. I'm going to guess that summer squash might be the most susceptible to squash bug, although winter squash and pumpkin can be affected, especially when populations are very high in the fall. So squash bug is a true bug. It is a piercing, sucking feeder. So you won't see holes, but they'll pierce through the leaf with their stylets, their little tube mouths, and the resulting leaf injury is physiological dysfunctions, right? So you won't immediately see issues for this disruption of the photosynthetic tissue. Disruption of the xylem vessels in many ways can cause problems, especially when plants are young. Plants colonized by squash bug nymphs in the 2 to 4 leaf stage may quickly succumb to feeding. Feeding of leaves during flowering and fruit set, so another susceptible time, that can impact fruit production from a yield point of view. Also, direct feeding to the fruit, they'll stick their schnozzes in the fruit too. It can result in blemishes, sunken areas. These feeding points can also be entry points for pathogens that cause fruit rots. So if you have a lot of fruit rots, I wonder if these nymphs or the adult feeding has something to do with that. This bug will also overwinter as an adult in the duff, but you won't see them emerge from their overwintering sites until later than the other beetles. They need a little bit more heat to develop and get going and wake up in the spring. They're a little bit lazier than the beetles we just talked about. So keep in mind, we will be counting our degree days in a different base, in base 58. The other two were in base 50, we're in 58 now. So when you go to NUA and enter your data, you're going to use a different base. You should expect to see adult squash bugs migrate into crops around 150 growing degree days in base 58. And you will start seeing egg masses pretty shortly after that, because they're probably in the family way by the time they're looking for your squash plants. So looking at NUA, that migration started somewhere around June 27th in Tamworth last year. So the beginning of July would be a good time to schedule hand picking if you're try to go in and collect adults or remove eggs. So those gold football shaped eggs, they're very difficult to crush. They're too hard to crush, but knocking them off the leaves onto the ground doesn't necessarily crush or kill them. However, it does make them much more susceptible to predation. There's a lot more predators on the ground that'll come and eat up those eggs, as well as some entomopathogens pathogens in the soil that could infect those eggs and kill them. If you're really wanting to be clean about it, bucket of soapy water and knock them in there and flush that down the toilet. Expect nymphs to hatch out and start feeding a couple weeks after you start seeing eggs. The degree day models say 550 growing degree days, or sometime in the middle of August in Tamworth, according to last year's example. I feel like maybe that would come a little bit earlier. I'm not quite sure about that. If you plan on using an insecticidal soap for your squash bug, the nymphs are the stage that you target for that, because those soaps, they can disrupt the integument of soft-bodied immature insects, but they'll have no effect on the adults or the eggs, and they're more likely to have very little impact on other insects too for the same reason. So very, very environmentally friendly. That summer generation of squash bugs will reach adulthood by 700 growing degree days in base 58, which occurred by mid-November in Tamworth of last year. Let me know if that makes sense. again, those adults will be seeking out overwintering habitat by that point. And our final pest on the list, stink bugs. So stink bugs in general have a pretty broad host range. They could be causing all sorts of different problems in the garden. Just thinking about vegetable crops, their piercing, sucking, feeding can cause like starburst injury in tomato fruits, in pepper fruits. That's a very common thing seen. Their feeding can cause distorted growth in things like green bean, especially if they're feeding very early on in the development of that and it grows out weird. That can be stink bug feeding. Brown marmorated stink bug can even cause damage in sweet corn. It has a harder, longer proboscis that can get into the husk. Other species can't do that. But I don't really see very much brown marmorated stink bug this far north and in high numbers in vegetable crops. So I'm going to cross that off the list. However, there's like 30 species of stink bugs that we can find in New Hampshire. The most common pest species are the very cleverly named brown stink bug and green stink bug. But then there's also a very important predatory stink bug called spine soldier bug. That's Pedicis maculaventris. It looks a lot like the brown stink bug as an adult, and it can also be mistaken with the green stink bug when they are nymphs. So these are very important biocontrols in your garden. So if you have spine soldier bug in your garden, that's great news. Another thing about stink bugs in general, and this is the case for most of the species I know, is they love moving in and out of gardens, from tree species into gardens and back and forth, like even within a day or two. So sometimes you will see them surge because of the physiology of the crop that they are interested in. So it's kind of hard to predict when you are going to see surges in stink bug population based on their population development. We could certainly do that, but I would like to hear more about the problems that you are seeing in your garden. Also, if you're not super sure if you are looking at the predator, that spine soldier bug, versus the pest species that might be in your garden, I personally might think about living with that cosmetic injury that is being caused by these species. But let me know, reach out. I want to know more about what kind of damage you're seeing from these pests. Are there other key pests that you want to hear more about when it comes to tracking and predicting when you're going to have periods of high risk? Let me know if this matches what you're seeing in real life. Do the data from NUA match up to what you're actually seeing? So let me know, and thanks for listening.